My name is Daniel. I'm 31 years old, and I live in Denver, Colorado. On paper, my life looks pretty stable. I work as a project manager in a growing company. I'm married to a woman I love deeply, and we have a small but comfortable apartment where we've been slowly building a life together. But sometimes the biggest struggles don't come from work, money, or even personal setbacks. Sometimes the real battles begin at the dinner table, during what's supposed to be a happy holiday trip. Before I get into the full story of what happened to me, let me set the stage. I was invited, or maybe I should say pressured, into spending a full week with my wife's family at a mountain lodge during the holiday season. My wife, Emily, swore it would be fun. She painted it as a chance for bonding, for relaxation, for laughter and warmth in the middle of snowy mountains. But instead of peace, I found myself walking into a war zone, though not the kind fought with weapons. No, this one was fought with subtle jabs, nitpicking remarks, and an endless stream of criticism that sucked the joy out of every passing day. And let me tell you this, by the end of that week, I wasn't the same man who had walked through the cabin doors with optimism in my heart. But before I tell you how I dealt with it, and how I turned the entire situation on its head, I want to ask you something. From which country and which city are you watching this right now? I'd love to know where our community of listeners is tuning in from, because stories like mine happen everywhere, across all cultures. And if you enjoy true-to-life revenge, stories filled with twists, emotions, and real lessons, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our growing family here. Trust me, you don't want to miss the stories that are coming up. Now, back to the cabin. Back to the holiday that began as a dream, but quickly spiraled into something much darker. The drive up was beautiful. Snow dusted the trees, and the winding road made me think of old postcards you'd find tucked away in a thrift shop, the kind that paint holidays as magical and picture-perfect. Emily was humming softly in the passenger seat, her face glowing with excitement. "This is going to be so nice," she said, squeezing my hand. "My parents are so excited to see us." I smiled, even though there was a nervous flutter in my stomach. I had met her parents plenty of times before, but always in shorter doses. Sunday dinners, birthdays, the occasional weekend barbecue. Those visits had been manageable. They weren't the warmest people, and they had their quirks, but I thought, it's only a week. I can handle a week. I had no idea what was waiting for me. When we arrived, I carried our luggage inside, trying to make a good impression. The lodge itself was stunning. Tall ceilings, a giant stone fireplace, windows that framed the snowy mountains like living artwork. For a second, I thought maybe Emily had been right. Maybe this really would be good for us. That thought didn't last long. As I stepped inside with the first suitcase, my mother-in-law Janet frowned. "Daniel, careful," she said sharply. "You're dragging the wheels. You'll scratch the floors." I froze, glancing down. The suitcase wasn't even touching the wooden boards. I smiled politely. "I'll be careful," but the tone she used, like I was a clumsy child instead of a grown man, made something tighten in my chest. And that was only the beginning. Within the first hour, I'd been told I poured the drinks too fast, that I took up too much space in the living room, and that the way I folded my coat looked sloppy. Every comment was small, almost insignificant on its own, but together they started to chip away at me. The days blurred into one another, and with each one came more criticisms. At breakfast, I offered to make coffee. My father-in-law, George, sipped his mug and shook his head. "You put too much sugar in yours, Daniel. That's why you can't taste the flavor of good coffee." Later, when I tried to help set the table, my sister-in-law, Linda, sighed. No, not like that. Forks on the left, knives on the right. It's really not that hard." Every time I tried to pitch in or join the conversation, I was met with a correction, a sigh, or an eye roll. If I stayed quiet, I was accused of being moody. If I spoke up, they said my tone was too sharp. Imagine living like that for days on end. By the third night, I was exhausted. Not from physical activity, but from the sheer effort of trying to exist without being criticized. One night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I finally spoke up. To Emily. "Do you hear how they talk to me?" I asked quietly, my voice tight with frustration. "It's non-stop. Everything I do is wrong." She looked at me with sympathy, but also with a hint of dismissal. "That's just how my family is," she said. "They don't mean anything by it." I stared at her, stunned. "Emily, it feels like I'm under a microscope. They're tearing me apart piece by piece." She placed her hand on mine. "Please, Daniel, it's only a week. Just let it go." "But how do you let go of something that follows you every waking hour? How do you ignore being made the butt of every conversation?" I tried. God knows I tried. But each day wore me down further. It was the 5th night when things finally snapped. I had decided to cook dinner, thinking maybe if I put genuine effort into something, they would finally see me in a different light. I spent hours preparing roast chicken, seasoned vegetables, and even fresh bread. I poured myself into it, wanting nothing more than to hear, "Good job, Daniel. Thank you." But when we sat down at the table, Janet took one bite of the chicken, chewed slowly and said, "Well, it's edible, but my roast chicken is always juicier." George sniffed at the bread. "Too dense. You don't know how to knead properly, do you?" Linda smirked. "Maybe next time just stick to setting the table. At least you can't ruin that." And then came the laughter. Not lighthearted, not playful. It was mocking, cruel. Something in me broke. I forced a smile, swallowing the burning anger that threatened to spill out. "You're right," I said softly. "Next time, I'll try harder." But inside, my thoughts were no longer about surviving the week. No. Inside, I was already planning. If they wanted to criticize me for every little thing, then fine. I would give them exactly what they wanted, but not in the way they expected. That night, as I lay awake in the guest room staring at the ceiling, I made a promise to myself. This holiday wouldn't end with me broken and humiliated. By the time we left this cabin, my in-laws would know exactly what it felt like to live under constant judgment, to have every move picked apart, every choice second-guessed. They thought I was weak, that I would keep taking their abuse in silence. But they were wrong. I had a plan. And once I set it in motion, there would be no going back. If you've been following along, you know by now that my so-called holiday trip with my in-laws turned into a week of endless criticism. Every word I spoke, every action I took, was judged and mocked, until exhaustion replaced joy. By the 5th night, after pouring my heart into cooking dinner only to be told my chicken was edible at best, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep letting them strip away my dignity. I couldn't keep walking on eggshells, praying for crumbs of approval that would never come. If they wanted to nitpick me, then fine. But I was going to show them what it felt like when the tables turned. So I began planning my revenge. At first, I thought about snapping back. Just one sharp comment for every jab they threw at me. But that would only escalate things, and it would give them exactly what they wanted. Proof that I was moody or too sensitive. No, I needed something smarter. Something subtle. If they thrived on criticism, then I would give them criticism. But disguised as polite, innocent observations. The same way they had done to me. My words would seem harmless on the surface, but underneath, they would sting. I decided I would mirror their behavior back to them. Every sigh, every correction, every mocking laugh they had aimed at me, I would reflect it right back, multiplied. The next morning, I woke up early. My in-laws were already in the kitchen, bustling around. George was reading the newspaper while Janet prepared eggs, and Linda scrolled through her phone, her face illuminated by the screen. "Good morning," I said cheerfully, forcing warmth into my voice. Janet glanced up. "Morning." Then, without missing a beat, "You really should shower earlier, Daniel. It's not good to let your hair dry like that. It looks unkempt." I smiled. The old me would have swallowed the comment and stayed quiet, but not this time. You're right, I replied smoothly. But actually, I read somewhere that overwashing hair at your age can thin it out. It might be better if you skipped a wash once in a while. Just a thought. The room went silent. Janet's eyes flickered with surprise, then irritation. George lowered his newspaper, looking at me curiously. Linda stifled a laugh. For the first time all week, the criticism hadn't landed on me. It had landed on her, and it felt good. Once I broke the ice, I started weaving little comments into every interaction. When George poured himself coffee and added 2 sugars, I tilted my head and said, "Careful, too much sugar at your age can be dangerous. Doctors recommend cutting back." When Linda showed us a photo she had taken of the mountains, I smiled politely. "That's nice, but holding the camera lower would have given it more depth. It's a pretty rookie mistake, but you'll learn." Each remark was delivered with the same fake politeness they had used on me. Just helpful enough to sound innocent, just sharp enough to sting. And slowly, I saw the shift. Janet grew quieter at the table. George grumbled more under his breath. Linda started biting her lip instead of laughing at my expense. For the first time, they were the ones under the microscope. Of course, Emily noticed the change. That evening, when we were alone in our room, she frowned at me. "Daniel, you've been different today. What's going on?" I shrugged innocently. "What do you mean?" "You keep making these little comments about their hair, their sugar, their photos. That's not like you." I met her eyes and gave a small smile. "Maybe I'm just picking up some of their habits." She sighed, clearly torn. "I just don't want this to turn into a fight." I kissed her forehead. "Don't worry, I'm just finding my voice." But deep down, I knew this was more than just finding my voice. This was about balance. This was about making them taste their own medicine, spoonful by spoonful. 2 nights later, I decided it was time to raise the stakes. We were gathered for dinner again, a spread of Janet's cooking filling the table. As the dishes were passed around, I leaned back, watching. George took a bite of the mashed potatoes and frowned slightly. A little too salty tonight. Normally, that kind of comment would have slid right off me. But this time, I leaned forward with a bright smile. "You know, George, it's easy to oversalt when your taste buds start to dull. It happens with age. Maybe you should let someone else season the food from now on." The table went quiet. Janet's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Linda's eyes darted between us. George's face flushed red. "My taste buds are fine." "Oh, of course," I said quickly. "I just meant, it's common. Nothing to be ashamed of." He grunted, stabbing his fork into the meat. That night, I could almost feel the shift in the air. For the first time, they weren't united against me. They were too busy licking their own wounds. The more I pushed, the more they unraveled. Janet began second-guessing herself in the kitchen, asking Emily to taste dishes before serving them. George became defensive about every choice he made, from his driving to the way he stacked firewood. Linda, who had always been quick to laugh at me, grew quieter, less sure of herself. It was subtle, but it was there, the cracks forming in their armor. And the best part? They didn't even realize I was the one causing it. They thought they were just having an off week, or maybe that the stress of the holiday was getting to them. But I knew the truth. I was turning their own weapons against them, and they were finally learning what it felt like. One night, as we lay in bed, Emily whispered, "They've been different lately, haven't they?" I turned to her, my face calm. "How so?" "They seem quieter, less sure of themselves. It's strange." I let the silence stretch before answering. "Maybe they're starting to understand how their words affect people." Her eyes widened slightly. And for the first time, I think she truly saw what I was doing. She didn't say anything more that night, but I could feel her hand grip mine a little tighter, as if torn between disapproval and pride. By the 6th day, I knew I had them right where I wanted them, but I wasn't done. Not yet. Because revenge isn't just about making someone feel small. It's about making sure they remember the lesson long after the moment has passed. And I had one final move planned. Something that would ensure they never looked at me the same way again. The seventh morning began like any other. George reading the paper, Janet fussing in the kitchen, Linda scrolling through her phone. But the air was heavier than before. There were fewer comments, fewer laughs. My earlier words had done their work, and now they moved around the cabin as if afraid of making a mistake. That was my cue. I walked into the kitchen and said cheerfully, "Morning. Smells great in here." Janet turned, spatula in hand, and gave me a tight smile. "Just making pancakes." I peered over her shoulder. The batter was lumpy, uneven. "Perfect. Interesting texture," I said lightly. "But don't worry. Some people just never get the hang of mixing properly." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to snap at me, but no words came out. She turned back to the stove in silence. George rustled his paper louder than usual. Linda didn't look up from her phone, and for the first time since the trip began, I felt like the one in control. Later that day, we planned a family board game session in the living room. Emily suggested it, probably hoping it would lighten the mood. We sat in a circle with mugs of hot chocolate, the snow falling outside, and the board spread out between us. But even here, the old habits tried to return. When it was my turn, George muttered, "Careful, Daniel. Don't mess it up like the firewood yesterday." I froze for a moment, then smiled. "You're right, George. I guess not all of us can stack wood as unevenly as you did. But hey, at least you tried." Emily's eyes flickered with warning, but it was too late. George's face darkened, and Janet shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Then when Linda made a move that cost her points, I leaned over and said with perfect politeness, "Don't worry, strategy takes time. Some people never quite get it, but you'll catch on eventually." Her cheeks flushed, and she didn't meet my gaze again. The game ended earlier than planned. No one wanted to play anymore, and I realized something. They were finally beginning to feel the exhaustion that I had felt all week. The joy of the holiday had been drained for them, just as it had been drained for me. That night, Emily confronted me again. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice low and urgent. "What are you doing? They're miserable. They don't even know how to talk around you anymore." I met her eyes, calm and steady. "And how do you think I felt, Emily? All week, every word I said was torn apart. Every move I made was mocked. Now they know what it feels like." She bit her lip, torn between her loyalty to me and her love for her family. "But this isn't you. You're not cruel." I softened my tone. "It's not cruelty, Emily, it's balance. If they never face the consequences of their words, they'll keep treating people this way forever. Sometimes the only way people learn is when they're forced to taste their own poison." Her shoulders slumped, but she didn't argue again. On the last night of the trip, we had one final dinner together. The table was set, candles flickered, and the smell of roasted meat filled the cabin. It should have been warm, festive, joyful, but instead, tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. As we sat down, Janet said stiffly, "I hope the food is satisfactory." It was the first time all week she hadn't criticized me outright. She was on edge, careful, almost afraid. I looked around the table, and for the first time I didn't feel like the outsider. I felt like the conductor of the entire scene. And that's when I delivered the final blow. I put down my fork, cleared my throat, and looked each of them in the eye. "You know," I began, "this week has been eye-opening for me. At first, I thought I was the problem. I thought maybe I wasn't good enough, that everything I did was wrong. But then I realized something. I realized that some people build themselves up by tearing others down. They hide their cruelty in polite words, in little jabs, in constant corrections. And they do it so often, they don't even notice the damage they cause." The room was silent. Even Emily stared at me. Her breath caught, So, this week, I continued. I decided to give you a gift. I decided to let you see what it feels like when someone turns that same lens on you. Every little thing you do, picked apart. Every choice, second-guessed. Every flaw, magnified. Not to hurt you, but to show you. To make you feel what I've been feeling. George shifted in his chair. Janet's lips trembled. Linda stared at the table. I leaned back, calm and steady. I hope you understand now. I hope the next time you're tempted to belittle someone, you'll remember this week. Because words may seem small, but they can cut deeper than you realize. And with that, I picked up my fork and took another bite of dinner. No one spoke for the rest of the meal. The silence was heavier than any insult, thicker than any laugh. When the plates were cleared, everyone went to bed early. There were no parting shots, no final jabs. Just quiet. The next morning, as we packed to leave the cabin, something surprising happened. Janet approached me first. She didn't meet my eyes, but her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. Daniel. About this week, maybe we were a little hard on you. George grunted something that might have been agreement. Linda simply gave me a small nod. It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was the closest thing I would ever get from them, and that was enough. On the drive back, Emily held my hand in the car. You really scared them, you know, she said, quietly. I smiled faintly. Good. Maybe they'll think twice next time. She was quiet for a long moment, then finally whispered, I think they will. And for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of peace when I thought about my in-laws. Not because they had changed completely, but because I had. I wasn't afraid of their words anymore. I wasn't their victim. I was their equal. And that's the story of how a holiday filled with criticism turned into a lesson none of us will ever forget. My in-laws thought they could break me down, but in the end, I showed them that words have weight, and sometimes the only way to teach respect is to make people taste their own medicine. Now, let me ask you, what would you have done in my place? Would you have fought back the way I did, or would you have stayed quiet and let it pass? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Also, tell me from which country and city you're watching this story. It always amazes me how many of you tune in from around the world. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and join our community. We share stories like this every week. Stories of revenge, justice, and lessons learned the hard way. Because sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to stay silent.